This is Robert Sapolsky, and you're listening to Father-Offspring Interviews.
Hi, welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews, episode 73. For our first question, Olivier from France says, is it true that there are 105 men for 100 women at birth to compensate for increased risk-taking behavior of men during their life?
It is absolutely true that it's a 105 to 100 ratio of newborn men to newborn women. And what you see is, yes, indeed, there is a skewing thereafter of a greater incidence of male deaths than female. By early adolescence is around the time when it's roughly 100 to 100. By the time you're looking at adulthood, early young adulthood, 20s or so, there's about 97 males for every 100 females. Westernized humans, by the time you look at old age, it's about 60 to 80 men for every 100 women. So, what is that about? Exactly what was noted there, which is males are riskier. Males are a less sensible way to go about being a primate in terms of longevity in a bunch of different ways. One, exactly as was brought up in the question, which is males have higher rates of accidents. Males have higher rates of being murdered, of substance abuse, of suicide. So all of that takes a toll. Next, turns out testosterone is one of the all-time imprudent hormones to have developed if you care about your cardiovascular health. And that testosterone does all sorts of things to increase the risk of cardiovascular disease, while estrogen has all sorts of protective antioxidant effects in your vasculature. So that's a good thing also. Probably the third reason is that on the average, males are taller and heavier than females, and thus on the average, males are more expensive. They're more expensive in terms of number of calories needed to keep somebody alive. And a great example of this, if you grow up in California, you learn all about the Donner Party, which I had never heard of before moving out here. Growing up in New York, instead you learn about Peter Stuyvesant's wooden leg. But Donner Party, 1860s or so, group of wagon train settlers coming out to make their fortune in California and coming through the Sierras. And there was like unseasonable storms months before winter, and they got stranded in this pass in the mountains. They didn't know where they were, which was surprising because they should have known this was Donner Pass. But in any case, they were stuck there through most of the winter. I think it was about 80 people, and only about half of them survived. And the lurid details that excite every California school child, the people who died, it was mixtures of starving to death, cannibalism, and murder, all very exciting. So various people, including the physiologist, historian, I don't know what he should be called by now, Jared Diamond, who's done an analysis of who survived in the Donner Party and who did not. What was one of the biggest predictors, one straight out of all of our emphases on social connectiveness and the social origins of disease and stuff? People who were singletons, who did not have spouses or family with them, were far less likely to survive. But the other biggest explanatory variable was being male. And that explained by body size, height. You got a big body, everybody's starving, you're going to starve to death sooner. So that being a demonstration of the ways in which male ratio relative to female plummets after birth. So 105 to 100 ratio at birth is some sort of evolved compensation for it. Now, what's interesting is this all begins way earlier than that. And this harks back many, many episodes ago when we were talking about prenatal determination of sex and all sorts of cool stuff that goes on with that. This problem of males being a problematic sex when it comes to humans and primates and mammals in general. This problem starts there right at conception because there's differential loss of male fetuses all throughout pregnancy relative to female fetuses, sufficiently so that at conception, quick primer. Sex determination is from male sperm. The female egg is always X. The male sperm is either an X or a Y. X meets X, you're going to have a daughter. X meets Y, you're going to have a son. So there is an excess, 110 to 100 ratio of Y chromosome bearing sperm to X chromosome bearing sperm in human males. At the time of fertilization, it's about a 108 to 100 ratio of male to female. By third trimester, it's about 106 to 100. All throughout pregnancy, males, once again, are more risky, more expensive metabolically. It is more metabolically costly to go through a pregnancy. And if you're a female who's pregnant, as opposed to a male who's pregnant, if you're a female who's pregnant and you've got a male growing in you, you are more likely to form an immune attack on a male fetus than a female fetus. So that contributes to some of it as well. So from day one, from conception thereafter, males are a chancier gamble to take evolutionarily in terms of who you want to have passing on composite genes in your future generations. And immediately from conception and still apparent at birth, there is a skew towards more males to compensate for a lifelong attrition of males relative to females.
Next, Alex from Israel says, I've been diagnosed with thyroid adenoma and hyperthyroidism, and my wife has autoimmune hyperthyroidism. We are both very thin and have explosive tempers. I would like to understand how the thyroid gland influences social and emotional processes, both in humans and in the animal world.
Alex, I have to thank you for bringing up this subject because for way too much of my professional career as a neuroendocrinologist, I have found the thyroid system to be totally boring and I've been very ignorant of it until stuff like your situation comes along. Thyroid hormone. Hormones, chemical messengers released into your bloodstream by glands. They travel around. They affect cells throughout the body that have receptors for that particular hormone. The basic organization, the most common organization of hormonal systems is the brain, by way of the hypothalamus, releases a hormone, which causes the pituitary to release a hormone, which causes the ovaries to secrete estrogen. And then the brain secretes a different hormone that causes the pituitary to secrete a different hormone that causes the testes to secrete testosterone. And the same thing in this case, the brain pituitary thyroid axis, the same three-step cascade. You've got a hormone coming out of the base of the brain, the hypothalamus, hormone called TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone, if you insist on knowing its name, which causes the pituitary to release thyroid stimulating hormone, which remarkably enough then stimulates the thyroid gland in your throat, causing it to release this hormone T4, which is soon converted to T3 and goes and does its thing. Its thing. This is where I would get totally bored because it would tap into a concept that like you got to realize like someday you're going to be forced to define it and you don't really know how to define what metabolism is. Thyroid hormone most dramatically influences your metabolism. Metabolism, for want of a better metaphor, and I'm sure this is a bad one, metabolism is like your economy. How much you're making, how much you're spending, how much you're producing, how much you're breaking down. Metabolism is like the sum of what your body is synthesizing and degrading. And thus, the term metabolism comes with two silver dollar specialized subterms with metabolism: anabolism and catabolism. Anabolism is the process of constructing new molecules. Catabolism, the process of breaking them down. So anabolism plus catabolism equals metabolism. And anabolism, some of you will recognize if you were taking anabolic steroids, testosterone derivatives, because you are a very unwise weightlifter or steroid abuser, it's anabolic, building up muscle mass. Okay, so metabolism. And what thyroid hormone does is basically increase metabolic rate throughout the body. more economic metaphors. What it does is it makes the teller at the bank window move more quickly. They take in money faster, they put out money faster, just everything moves faster. It increases the rate of the energy economy in the body. How does it do this? One very fundamental thing it does of just making cells function faster, there's this enzyme called sodium potassium ATPase, and it is ubiquitous. It's found in cells all over the body, and it is shuttling ions back and forth across membranes, which regulates excitability of various types of cells. You make more of it when thyroid hormone is around. When thyroid hormone T4, T3 is working throughout the body. What else? It increases muscle mass. Most dramatically, it increases your cardiovascular tone. Your heart muscles beat with more force because they are shuttling more excitatory signals around. Just so that is what thyroid hormone is doing. It's supporting metabolism. Huge, gigantic surprise. The levels of it normally peak early in the day when you get up, when you're starting your day's physical challenges, circadian peak, and then it troughs out. It hits its bottom when you're asleep. All right, so that's the basic workings of the thyroid hormone system, and you will note the brain has not been mentioned in here at all. Two different ways, actually far more than two, but for our purposes, two different ways in which the thyroid gland can get screwy. First one, the immune system attacks it with an autoimmune disease. Your immune system screws up. Its job is to tell the difference between you and bacteria, pathogens, viruses, parasites, etc. Attack the things that are not you and protect the things that are you. In autoimmune disease, your immune system screws up and decides a normal part of you is in fact something that needs to be attacked. And in one type of autoimmune thyroid disease, your immune system decides your thyroid gland is in fact alien, invasive, and does an attack against it and essentially destroys your thyroid gland. This is Hashimoto's disease. What's the result of that? You don't secrete thyroid hormone anymore. Your pituitary, your brain are working like crazy because they're not getting any sort of satisfaction at the thyroid level. So Hashimoto's disease, an absence of thyroid hormone. What are the symptoms of it? Your metabolism slows down. People become tired all the time. They become sluggish. Their thinking slows down. They put on weight. Their heart rate decreases. Their breathing rate decreases. They're cold all the time because you're not generating enough heat in your body. Okay, so that's the picture when your immune system has destroyed your thyroid gland. The opposite situation, as Alex alluded to, is when you have a different type of autoimmune attack on your thyroid. And this is one rather than your immune system going crazy and destroying your thyroid, your immune system goes crazy and overstimulates your thyroid gland. And thus you have what is termed Graves' disease. Hashimoto's disease, you destroy the thyroid gland, thus you are hypothyroid. Graves' disease, your immune system goes and stimulates your thyroid gland like crazy, and thus you suffer from hyperthyroidism. What's the symptoms of that? Exactly the opposite as to what you see with Hashimoto's. Weight loss, skinny, high metabolic rate, high heart rate, high breathing rate, elevated body temperature, you're hot, all of that. Everything is going at high speed there. Hyperactivity, a very, very telling sign. Often your eyes bulge out. Exophthalmia as a very indicative sort of measure of the disease. Okay, so we got two different ways it can go wrong. Too little thyroid hormone, too much thyroid hormone. And as we also heard from Alex's question, these are not the only ways where you could wind up being hypothyroid or hyper. Okay, so that's great. And once again, we still have nothing to do with the brain here, except for some interesting hints that I just gave a few minutes ago. When you have Hashimoto's hypothyroidism, cognition gets sluggish, memory often is a little bit impaired. That's got brain written all over it rather than like muscles or hearts or blood vessels or whatever. But a far more dramatic hint that this hormone has a lot to do with what's going on in your brain comes from two observations. The first one is people who have undiagnosed hypothyroidism, Hashimoto's disease, not enough thyroid hormone, often zero thyroid hormone, often they get depressed. Often their first signs are clinical depression. Whoa, what's that? Everything slows down, including your brain. Okay, there's lots of ways to think about depression metaphorically, but your brain slowed down. It does not immediately jump out because it's a loss of pleasure, it's a exaggerated sense of grief, despair, all of that. But one other major feature of depression is what's called psychomotor retardation. It is exhausting to do. It is exhausting to think. And when you see depression that is driven by an undiagnosed underlying case of hypothyroidism, the psychomotor retardation, the slowing down, is what tends to dominate. And that's a subtype of depression called atypical depression. Okay, so whoa, that's mighty interesting. And depending on which paper you cite, anywhere from 10 to 20% of cases of people who get a depression diagnosis, it turns out they have an underlying hypothyroid disorder of some sort, and give them replacement thyroid hormone. And among all the other things, it clears up the depression. So, thyroid hormone not enough, you tend to get depressed. Then, pathologically elevated levels, hyperthyroidism, as seen with this Graves' disease, and what you see is agitation and restlessness and irritability and anxiety, and at an extreme, mania. And there's a small subset of people with manic disorders where it turns out they have an underlying problem with an excess of thyroid hormone, and that's typically one of the defining things. Whoa, so we've just seen this hormone, which is just about like how fast your bladder is making urine and dumping urine, and just econometric stuff, is influencing how exciting you see the world to be, how exhausting life is, how optimistic you are. Yeah, it's yet another hormone that gets into the brain and has all sorts of behavioral effects. So, how is thyroid hormone doing this? And predictably, there are a gazillion papers out there showing effects of thyroid hormones on levels of the neurotransmitter serotonin, on dopamine, on this neurotransmitter, on this brain enzyme. It's doing stuff all over the place. Looking through the literature, the most meaningful link has to do with a part of the brain called the locus coeruleus. And I can't wait to see what the print underneath here is going to do with it, because it's virtually impossible to spell locus coeruleus correctly. I'm fairly sure I never have. The locus coeruleus. What is it about? Okay, out back to thyroid hormone speeding up your metabolism. Your heart is beating faster. How is it doing that, for example? It makes the heart more sensitive to adrenaline. It sensitizes heart muscles to the stimulatory effects of adrenaline. Now, adrenaline is known as adrenaline only in the UK formally. Here, more formally, it's known as epinephrine. Closely related to adrenaline in the UK is noradrenaline. In the US, norepinephrine. The locus coeruleus is the part of the brain that makes the most use of norepinephrine as a neurotransmitter. It's a projection that just goes broadly throughout the brain. And what does locus coeruleus derived norepinephrine do to the brain? Kind of what adrenaline, epinephrine, does throughout the body. It increases excitability throughout the brain. And what do thyroid hormones do? They increase excitability of neurons in the locus coeruleus, thus releasing more norepinephrine. You're nice and drowsy, your locus coeruleus is nice and drowsy. Somebody scares the bejesus out of you, jumping out, and both you and the locus coeruleus have your stomachs in your throat at the same time. This seems to be, at least for my money, looking at the literature, the most interesting pathway by which a shortage of thyroid hormone, makes for a sluggish locus coeruleus, makes for a brain that's prone towards psychomotor retardation, a particular flavor of depression, and why an excess of thyroid hormone makes for a locus coeruleus norepinephrine system and thus the rest of the brain that's prone towards restlessness and irritability and the temper of Alex and wife, and in rare cases at an extreme, even a risk of mania.
Finally, Rich from Honduras says, have you seen the twin telepathy challenge trend on TikTok?
I had not before this question came in, but I now know all about it. I believe I've watched every one that's been posted on TikTok, as well as commentaries and analyses and documentaries about it on YouTube. The Twin Telepathy Challenge. Here's what you do: you get identical twins and you put them on either side of a wall or something where you can film them. You could see both of them, but they can't see each other. And somebody, usually sounding like their mother, says, okay, lift a leg, lift a hand, touch a part on your body, go in a circle, a bunch of commands like this. And what you're supposed to see is freakily, uncannily, they do the exact same thing. They both lift the same leg at the exact same instant. They both touch the same elbow or same nose or whatever. They do they circle in the same direction at the same speed. More questions that tend to be asked: okay, pick a number from 1 to 5 and show me what it is by holding up your fingers. Do that. Make a funny face. And what the whole point is that you're seeing that, whoa, these identical twins, they do everything exactly the same, and thus twin telepathy. Okay, so one of the things we aim for in this whole series is to be uplifting, which is why we spent so much time talking about war and environmental catastrophe and dementias and such, and was certainly hoping to continue that cheery theme here. But after having watched a whole bunch of these, I think I have to conclude that this twin telepathy deal is a load of hooey, that there is not actually any telepathic communication going on. Okay, why is that? So you got these two individuals in there, and right off the bat, pick any two random people off of Earth and tell them to pick up their leg, lift a leg, and they're going to lift their dominant leg. Lift an arm, the exact same thing. Are they a lefty or are they a righty? And two random humans on Earth have an 85% chance of having the same handedness as each other. About 83% of both being right-handed, about a 2% chance of both being left-handed. So right off the bat, you take random people and they are likely to have the same handedness, the same leggedness, and thus lift a leg. They're likely to both lift the same leg, lift the same arm. Wow, look at that. Look at monozygotic twins who share handedness to a greater extent than do non-identical dizygotic twins, let alone the general population. So it's no surprise that they do that. Touch a part of your body, you lift your dominant hand and you touch your nose, you touch your shoulder. So not surprising that there's a lot of convergence there. People tend to circle going in the clockwise direction, so you get convergence there. Interestingly, where you get the least convergence, the least agreement between the two twins, as you look at a gazillion of these, is when it comes to make a funny face, because everybody comes up with an idiosyncratically different one, and it's mighty hard to argue that it's the identical funny face, but that tends to be fairly divergent. And then when pick a number from 1 to 5 and show me with the number of fingers you have, highly, highly divergent. That had the lowest rate of people putting up the same number of fingers. The one exception being when they do the easiest thing to do with fingers, which is to just put up two of them. That's the most common one, unless you're, oh, I don't know, Leonard Nimoy or Cohen, and this is the thing you do reflexively. But this is the one that is not only most common, but showed the most concordance between the two twins. So that was not terribly impressive. Tell me your favorite food. Yeah, they're identical twins growing up in the same household. There's a fairly good chance they're going to say the same thing. So that's one thing when you look at it, it's pretty stacked towards people doing things in a rather synchronized way. So that's the first hole I saw with it in terms of the questions that are asked. The next problem is you look at these, and about half of these are edited, which was heartbreaking for me to see, which was an outrage. Edited, edited. Here's the most amazing example of something edited you could see on all of YouTube. Coco. Coco, the gorilla who supposedly had mastered American Sign Language, the first gorilla to do so, totally. Coco was lovely. I loved Coco. Coco was wonderful, but Safi's food bowl knows more American Sign Language than Coco knew. And famously, Coco was filmed addressing the United Nations, urging them to do something about global warming in American Sign Language. And you look at it, and Coco is signing me Coco, me gorilla, me life, me nature, sad people, save the earth, save the earth. And you look at it, and it's 20 separate edits over the course of this 30-second thing. Coco would make a sign. Coco, presumably, they filmed making every single sign and every made up sign imaginable for a gorilla to come up with. And then they edited it and cut and spliced. And here's Coco giving like the most moving thing since the Sermon on the Mount. Same thing with about half of these twin telepathies. They're spliced between the different commands. So lift your leg, they lift the same leg. They lift opposite legs. One of them lifts both legs, the other doesn't lift a leg. Okay, film each one and then just get the only one. So this big sham of a fraud going on with about half these twin telepathy things. Suppose, however, for the ones that were legit, that weren't edited, and were even asking for things other than, okay, which is your dominant hand, which is your dominant leg, asking things that were more idiosyncratic than that. Suppose you were getting incredible sort of agreement between the two. Are you seeing genes, parentheses, identical genes in action? No reason to conclude that. Identical twins share a fetal environment that is much more similar to each other than non-identical twins do, and then certainly than any two random siblings do of separate pregnancies. Identical twins are raised more similarly than non-identical twins, and that much more likely they're going to have the same food tastes and the same favorite number between 1 and 5 and the same funny face or some such thing. In other words, what the big problem is with these studies is they don't have controls. They need to have controls, to have some non-identical twins, to have some siblings who were not twins at all, to have some identical twins who were separated at birth and raised in different parts of the world and brought back in time to be filmed. Two completely random people on Earth who were stuck in the same womb for 9 months and then put them through. You see how the science on this should have been done. So at the moment, I don't think there's a whole lot of evidence for telepathic identical twins out there. Nonetheless, these are kind of fun to look at, and especially the thing that is most reliable is about 2/3 of the way through when they do something at the same time, someone off camera says, "You guys really are twins," and then everybody giggles. That seems to be the most reliable thing in these experiments. Okay, amid us trying to run a respectable operation here, mistakes sneak in now and then. So I wanted to address two of them and one postscript. One of them came a number of weeks ago when talking about a problem in the psychology literature, which is that it is overwhelmingly derived from studies of like first year psychology majors volunteering for an experiment in a university, and thus you are getting a very small subsection of what Earth's humans are like, very unrepresentative learning what the human psyche is about. And this is the problem of weird populations that are winding up in psych studies, disproportionately people coming from countries, backgrounds that are westernized, educated, industrialized, relatively rich, and coming from a democratic tradition. And when I first brought this up in one context many weeks ago, I got one of the letters wrong. And to try to make people think that didn't actually happen 2 weeks later, I very awkwardly brought up the concept of weird once again and used it correctly. But in any case, it is westernized, educated, industrialized, rich, and from a democratic nation. Next problem. A few weeks ago, I discussed the anthropologist, just in passing, the anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski, who's the person who seemingly started the belief that missionaries told people of various indigenous populations what kind of sexual positions they should have, and identified him as the British anthropologist. He was, in fact, Polish. He moved to England in adulthood, and the reason why I always associate him with England is one of my heroes when I was a kid was Jomo Kenyatta, who was the independence leader and first president of Kenya. And I read a biography of him back when, and at one point he went to the London School of Economics and studied anthropology with Malinowski, and thus I filed Malinowski away as being a Brit rather than a Polish Brit or whatever it was. Finally, last episode, 2 episodes ago, I was talking about this trio of baboons: Joshua, Ruthie, and Obadiah. Joshua and Ruthie, two adolescent baboons. Ruthie going through her first estrus cycles and not quite being attractive enough yet to get the big males interested in her, and thus when she was cycling, winding up with nerdy, pimply adolescent Joshua. The two of them together were very unexpectedly, the two of them over the course of 4 or 5 days, mating together repeatedly during her peak cycle. She got pregnant and she gave birth to Obadiah, and wasn't that interesting? And Joshua, because of the certainty that he was the father, not surprisingly, turned out to be highly atypically paternal in his behavior. Okay, so one would now ask, did Joshua and Ruthie from that point pioneer a completely new behavioral style in baboons? Did they remain as a monogamous pair? Did they form a nice, good Norman Rockwell nuclear family and transform baboon social systems thereafter? Sadly, that was not the case. Like so much young love, it turned out not to be long lasting. Ruthie's estrus swellings became more interesting to the big males, and she was off with them and had absolutely nothing to do with him for the rest of his life. He wound up being a middling level male of no great accomplishment except for being the alpha male once for about 2 weeks before he was promptly toppled. Obadiah grew up as a reasonably weird adolescent male before transferring to some other troop in Tanzania or something. So that is what came of them.
And that is it for episode 73. I'm Offspring Share Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of science and the beard.